Always true.
We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?
Is that going to be?
October last year, US President Donald Trump signs an executive order lifting some trade and economic sanctions against Sudan. It followed a State Department report that said Khartoum had improved its fight against armed groups. But the US still designates Sudan as a state sponsor of terrorism, along with Iran, North Korea and Syria. Regionally, it's mediating a peace deal between the warring parties in South Sudan, which gained its independence in 2011. Sudan is also taking part in the Saudi-UAE military operations in Yemen, with troops on the ground and several fighter jets. President Omar al-Bashir has been in power since 1989. He's the first head of state to be indicted by the International Criminal Court for suspected war crimes. He dissolved his government last month amid a widespread economic crisis. But after almost 30 years as president, will Bashir seek another term in 2020, or will he pave the way for the next generation? Sudan's Foreign Minister, al-Dirdiri Mohammed Ahmed, talks to Al Jazeera. Al-Dirdiri Mohammed Ahmed, Foreign Minister of Sudan, thank you for talking to Al Jazeera. May I start by asking you whether change is in the air in Sudan? One senior diplomat said to me, Sudan used to be seen as a troublemaker. Now it's trying to be a peacemaker.
Well, thank you very much. I think what's happening in Sudan right now, of course, might be considered by some to be new, but in fact, it's an indication of a trend that started very early in the country, since the time when we decided to give the right of self-determination to South Sudan. It was part of our effort to really resolve problems in the country, and we have been pursuing this path for quite a time.
One of the big things that's changed in the last year is the way you are perceived, particularly by the United States, because they've lifted some of the sanctions against you. Let's just go back to the 1990s, when Bill Clinton first put those sanctions in place. You were seen as a pariah state. At one point, Osama bin Laden was living in Khartoum. They fired missiles, bombs at Khartoum at one point. They blamed you for the US Embassy bombings in Africa. They blamed you for the attack on the USS Cole. You really were in the US's bad books.
Well, but what was the reason for that? I do not find at all any answer here in the United States. Nobody can tell me exactly why Sudan was in the first place included in that list. If it's for the Osama bin Laden short stay in Sudan, Osama bin Laden had stayed for quite longer periods in other parts of the world, in other countries. The US itself included, and his stay in Sudan was before he established al-Qaeda or established any links with international terrorism, even before the time he went to Afghanistan. So why Sudan in particular is to be included because of the stay of Osama, nobody knows.
There are still some sanctions in place, and most importantly, there's this designation that you are a state sponsor of terror. Tell us what that designation means. How bad is that for Sudan?
We're having two phases of engagement with the United States. The first phase, which had ended some time ago, had led to the lifting of Sudan from particular sanctions, particularly economic sanctions, and now we look forward to start the new phase of engagement, which is basically intended to see to it that Sudan's name is dropped from the list of states sponsoring terrorism.
My understanding is the US are pushing for two things in the second phase: an end to state-sponsored violence and an improvement in the human rights record. Let's deal with the first one of those, state-sponsored violence, in particular in the so-called two areas and in Darfur, where the UN is winding down that joint mission it has with the African Union. Do you accept that in the past your government has been involved in repression in those areas, and is that something that's ending?
As you know, what was taking place in South Kordofan and Blue Nile was very much connected to what takes place in South Sudan. The movement that took up weapons in those two areas was, for the time being, part of the governing party in South Sudan. So the relation between them was obvious. because of what is happening right now in South Sudan, we believe that it is now very much timely to address the issue of rebellion in South Kordofan and Blue Nile, and to put it really in the right perspective, and to see to it that also level of violence in those areas subsides.
But clearly there are people on the ground in those areas who have grievances. How do you meet those grievances?
We addressed that matter before with respect to South Sudan and arrived at a formula for peace and reconciliation, for social healing, and we feel that the same would also apply to those two areas.
Of course, the other issue is human rights, and there are still human rights abuses according to human rights organisations. This is a recent letter that was written by 31 human rights organisations, international ones like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, plus African human rights organisations, and ones that deal specifically with Sudan. They say there's a suppression of peaceful protests, they say there's excessive force, attacks on the media, arbitrary detention, trumped-up criminal proceedings, ill treatment, torture and ongoing violence in Darfur, South Kordofan and Blue Nile.
Well, I thought that also you will dig out from your arsenal of documents and reports. The report that was issued by the Human Rights Council, the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva, about the progress that was made by Sudan over the previous year. This is the first and the most important report that we got since 25 years. Human rights in Sudan is improving, and human rights situation is improving, and we believe that the progress that we have just made and recorded at the Human Rights Council is a progress that should be sustainable and a progress that we would pursue further.
Of course, in the past, there have been all sorts of allegations against your government and your president, particularly with regard to Darfur. You'll remember a former Secretary of State, Colin Powell, accused your government of committing genocide. There are 2 international arrest warrants out for your president from the International Criminal Court. Those are still there.
Well, the fact that the African Union in its entirety is not having confidence in the International Criminal Court, nor is the United States, and also so many circles joining this unanimity, merging unanimity against the ICC, tells us that whatever accusations or indictments issued by the ICC are in fact meaning very little in the international community.
It was your predecessor, Ibrahim Gandor, who did the negotiations with the United States to get the first group of sanctions lifted. He, before he left his job, complained that Sudan's diplomats were not being paid. You won't be able to pay the rent on various of your embassies around the world. Doesn't this show one big problem area? Even though some of the sanctions have been lifted, your economy remains in a dire state.
Indeed it is. We are facing a lot of problems because of the sanctions that were imposed on us by the United States of America unilaterally, and also some of the multilateral sanctions that were imposed on us because of the issue of Darfur. We look forward now to lifting those sanctions, and definitely this will give us an opportunity also to be integrated more and more in the international economy and solve the economic problems that we are facing.
One of the things that has happened in recent months surprised me, which is Sudan took on the role as the negotiator with regard to South Sudan. It surprised me because you were involved in the longest civil war in Africa with the people who now are South Sudan. How did that come about that you got this role to negotiate? Why did Sudan put itself forward, and why did the regional countries decide you should try and solve this?
Sudan is the most connected to South Sudan for so many reasons that are very obvious. Secondly, Sudan is also the most influenced by what is taking place currently in South Sudan. In terms of receiving more refugees from South Sudan, in terms of also being affected by the insecurity in South Sudan. We are receiving a lot of small weapons that are smuggled from South Sudan. And because, of course, also we have lost a lot of opportunities of working together with South Sudan to alleviate poverty and to assist our economies. This is the reason why everybody in the region feels that Sudan is better placed and better positioned to deal with the matter and to take up the reconciliation effort of South Sudan a step further.
In the past, South Sudan, that issue, has seen some rivalry between Uganda and Sudan. Have you done some sort of deal with Uganda? Because some analysts are suggesting maybe you've decided to share the oil revenues of South Sudan in return for doing this new peace deal.
There is no deal between Sudan and Uganda in terms of sharing anything. Uganda is not having anything to do with South Sudan oil. South Sudan oil is bordering with Sudan. What's going to happen in this matter is that we will be restoring the South Sudan oil fields to their former levels of production. That's going to help the economy of South Sudan, of course, basically because that's the country to which the oil revenues will go. It will also help us indirectly because we are going to draw also our dues and royalties of transporting the oil through our pipeline to Port Sudan. Uganda, of course, is a neighboring country that will benefit from peace and stability in South Sudan, the way we are going to benefit and the way Ethiopia and Kenya will benefit also. Maybe the new thing that has changed is the fact that Uganda and Sudan started working together, whereas in the past we were not working together. We discussed the matter. We found that if South Sudan is going to continue as is and the situation in South Sudan is going to deteriorate, we will be having a black hole in the region, another Somalia in the region, even if Somalia has right now resuscitated from what had happened. But of course, South Sudan could also be another problem to the region in its generality, and in particular to Uganda and Sudan. Uganda and Sudan right now are receiving more refugees from South Sudan than any other country. And this is the reason why the two countries really decided to work together and to see to it that South Sudan stabilizes and that peace prevails in South Sudan.
Because in South Sudan we have a new country that's only existed for 7 years, and we've had much of that time with conflict. A new report from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine did an analysis. They believe the death toll is much greater than people thought before, maybe as many as 400,000. Tell me how this new deal is going to work. My understanding is it's the same two men at the centre of it. President Salva Kiir and Riek Machar is going to be the vice president. Have we not tried this before and it failed? Aren't you putting your trust in the two same men who failed before?
It's not about two men. It's about...
Some would say it is. It's a personal feud. Is there not an element of that?
Well, I think we have to look deeper and find out that, in fact, the problem that we face in South Sudan is that the society in its entirety is vertically divided between two communities. That is the Nuer and the Dinka. The two men are representing those two communities. If we are going to remove the two men and then we find out that the conflict is still continuing and we are not addressing the main reasons for the real conflict, the dichotomy between the two communities, then we will not be resolving the matter. Now, it is now the challenge that is being posed to South Sudanese themselves is to really see to it that once again they create confidence among themselves in the first place and between their country and the international community at large. And I think there is no reason for them not to live up to this challenge.
It's a detailed agreement. Perhaps you could explain to us what happens next. My understanding is there is a ceasefire in place, and then we have the strange term cantonment. You're going to get the forces from both sides to go back to their military bases and try and turn them into one army. Is that right?
Exactly. We're speaking about the activities that shall take place within the pre-transition. That's a period of 8 months in which we should see to it that all of the forces and troops will be assembled separately, and that also a measure of disengagement is pursued. And then we follow through to see to it that the right people from different camps are selected and trained jointly to create what we are now referring to as the nucleus army of South Sudan. This is an army that should be loyal only to South Sudan, not to any tribe or ethnic group. It shall be a detribal and detribalized army, and it shall really be the reason for peace and stability to prevail in South Sudan in the future. This is one of the major activities that should now take place within the pre-transition.
And what happens while this is going on? The UN Special Representative Nicholas Haysom has talked of a security gap. How do you fill that?
Well, we agree that some measures need now to be boosted or stepped up while this is happening. UNMISS, for instance, which is a peacekeeping...
That's the UN force in South Sudan.
Yeah, should right now be boosted. The RFB, which is the Regional Protection Force, should also be boosted. We believe that Uganda and Sudan in particular should be included in this force.
How many more troops?
About 4,000 troops. We believe that this is very much required to fill any security gap that might appear.
Now, of course, we're dealing with South Sudan, we're dealing with Sudan. There's one bit left over, which is Abyei. I know it's a place you know well. You're from that part of Sudan in the first place. What happens with Abyei? That's the bit that, under the international agreements, no one's decided which country it should be in.
Well, as you know, we are currently having the UNISA force. Now the UN is discussing the matter and trying to find out whether the UNISA force needs to be configured. It is our conviction that for the time being, we should better continue with this force as is. We have voiced this concern to the UN Secretary General. The same concern was voiced out also to them by the first Vice President of South Sudan. We believe that it's not time now for changing the troops that are present in Abyei. We have started talking about Abyei maybe up to now informally. That's the two countries, the two communities as well. And we believe that in due course there will be an agreement on what should be the next step in Abyei.
You live in an interesting neighbourhood. In fact, one could argue you live in two neighbourhoods because you're a member of the African Union and also a member of the Arab League. And as you know, there's all sorts of divisions and shifting alliances going on. For example, the disputes over the Nile between Ethiopia and Egypt, or in the Middle East there seems to be lines being drawn between Saudi Arabia, UAE and Egypt, and perhaps Turkey and Qatar on the other side. And yet you seem to be steering a middle path in these divisions.
Well, this is in fact what we are trying to do. And sometimes we succeed. But sometimes also we find it very difficult to convince the different parties that we better pursue this middle ground and instead of trying to take sides. Of course, we always think that it's for the best interest of all of concerned parties to recognize that Sudan is a country that is having its own problems, that requires peace within itself, and requires time to address its own issues first and foremost.
Because you have substantial Saudi involvement and Egyptian investments in Sudan, and yet it's reported that you have done a deal with Turkey for a naval base and Qatar for a port. How are you managing to pull off this trick of keeping everyone happy, it seems, for now?
Well, we did not agree for any naval base.
Yes.
It's a sort of development project to the city of Sawakin. We haven't agreed, to allocate any part of Sudan to any country. But nonetheless, we're working with all of the players in the region to see to it that the region is stable, Turkey included and Qatar included. And we hope that also this will not mean that Sudan is taking sides at all in any dispute. We hope for the best of all of the region, and we are doing our best to see to it that all the problems that are now being faced by the states in the region will be resolved peacefully and amicably.
There is one dispute where you're taking a side, and that's Yemen. You are part of the coalition led by Saudi Arabia and UAE. Are you happy with your role in that coalition that, according to the Human Rights Office of the United Nations, there have been 17,000 civilian deaths between March 2015 and August 2018, 18, and they say that the majority of these casualties were carried out by the Saudi-led coalition and its bombing. Does that concern you? Also, allegations that the UAE troops have been involved in all sorts of torture at their camps.
Well, of course, what's happening in any war is that definitely some measures that are taken, well-intended measures, might go awry and might affect, civilians. But nonetheless, it's my opinion and belief that nobody is really targeting civilians per se, or thinking that civilians should be the target of any reprisals during this war. For the time being, it's obvious that we are part and parcel of that coalition, but this does not mean that we have stopped studying the situation.
So it's still under review?
Definitely, we will always study the situation and find out what are the most appropriate things for us to do.
And of course, the thing that all of the humanitarian community are concerned about with regard to the war in Yemen concerns the coalition's next move and what they do with regard to Hodeidah, which is a city, but most importantly, a port that provides so much food for Yemen. Should there be an all-out onslaught in Hodeidah, in your view? Because Mark Lowcock, the humanitarian coordinator of the UN, said that could be the worst humanitarian catastrophe of the 21st century.
We are trying our best with our allies to see to it that any humanitarian situation that is unfavorable is to be avoided in Yemen. We are in close consultation with all of our allies in this matter, and we are very hopeful that such situation will be avoided.
We've talked about a feeling of change potentially in Sudan and in the region. But of course, in Sudan, one thing doesn't change, and that is your president, Omar al-Bashir. He seized power in a military coup. He's since been elected. I'm not saying he's in any way a dictator, but that's how he got to power. That was in 1989. So next year he'll have been in power for 30 years. I understand that your National Congress party already want him to be the candidate in the election 2020. Is it really right for him to keep going on and on? Because the history of Africa shows that many leaders go on too long. Just look at Mugabe.
Well, situation in Africa might not be, of course, different from what is taking place anywhere in the world. But we have to really see to it that and recognize that democracy needs time to take root. We have started a process of democratization in our country. We have right now had a constitution that everybody respects and accepts, opposition parties included. Some of the people who are right now fighting with us are all of the time voicing concern about the respect of the constitution. This has not been the case a few years ago before that constitution was put in place. This is a huge, step taken forward. And then democracy will gradually take root. You can't create democracy overnight. This means that the processes of election, democratization, and regular, bouts of violence, which should be avoided and replaced by in fact, recourse to the ballot box, is a process that will continue for a very long while in any state to really take root. And we have started that, and we're very hopeful that in due course we will be really speaking about a full-fledged democracy.
But I remember the last election, President Bashir himself said, "I'm not sure I want to go on," and said that he was persuaded by his party. Isn't it really time now? You have a very strong ruling party for a new person to lead Sudan going forward.
That process, I think, is right now undergoing. We have witnessed just a few days ago a change when a young prime minister has taken over to replace another prime minister who was there for a while. And we hope this process will continue.
So do you have discussions ever with President Bashir about how long he will stay in the job? Do you say to him, "Don't overstay your welcome, Your Excellency"?
Well, of course, this is a matter that is now being considered within the political bureau of the ruling party, and definitely discussions like the one we are suggesting are taking place.
Foreign Minister, thank you very much for speaking to Al
Jazeera.
Jazeera.
Yeah, most welcome.